2:31 a.m. Strait of Hormuz, Eastern Approach Corridor, 28 nautical miles from the Iranian coast. 5 Iranian coastal missile systems just activated simultaneously along a 90-kilometer stretch of coastline. Not one battery, not two. 5. Positioned at intervals that created overlapping engagement envelopes across every viable approach bearing to the strait's eastern entry point. The activation was precise, coordinated, and it covered the exact section of water where the USS Theodore Roosevelt carrier strike group was scheduled to begin its strait transit in 4 hours and 17 minutes. U.S. naval forces began moving into defensive positions immediately. Welcome to Navy Strikeforce. Today, we're going inside the 193 minutes that followed that activation. 193 minutes in which a 5-battery Iranian coastal activation timed against a known carrier transit schedule. A layered U.S. defensive repositioning that involved 3 surface combatants, 2 submarine assets, and 4 different aviation elements, and a decision made at the CENTCOM level that shaped how the transit ultimately proceeded, produced the most complex defensive formation evolution the U.S. Navy had executed in the Strait of Hormuz in years. This is what moving a carrier strike group into a defensive position against an active coastal missile threat actually requires. Not the press release version. The operational version. Every asset, every decision, every trade-off between defensive coverage and transit schedule, explained in the detail that matters. To understand why 5 activated coastal missile systems warranted a defensive repositioning rather than simply a watchful transit, you need to understand what the specific systems activated represent in terms of terminal threat characteristics and why their coordinated activation against a known transit schedule crosses a threshold that single battery activations do not. The 5 systems identified from their radar emission signatures were a mixed battery deployment: 2 NOR anti-ship missile batteries, 2 Ghadr batteries, and 1 Khalij Fars. An anti-ship ballistic missile derived from the Fateh 110 series, with a terminal guidance system specifically designed for maneuvering surface ship engagement. The Khalij Fars is operationally significant because it combines the unpredictable terminal flight profile of a ballistic weapon, high speed, steep angle of descent, with a seeker system capable of adjusting its trajectory in the final kilometers to compensate for ship movement. Defending against an anti-ship ballistic missile with a maneuvering terminal guidance system requires a different defensive response than defending against a sea-skimming anti-ship cruise missile. The NOR and Ghadr sea-skimming profiles are manageable by the Aegis SM-2 system with appropriate engagement geometry. The Khalij Fars terminal profile, coming down steeply at high velocity with mid-course corrections, requires SM-3 or SM-6 engagement at higher altitude before the terminal dive, while the missile is still in its ballistic phase. That engagement requires the defending ship to be positioned for an upward-looking intercept geometry rather than the near horizontal engagement geometry optimized for sea-skimming threats. One defensive geometry cannot simultaneously optimize for both threat types. A formation that positions its Aegis systems for sea-skimming cruise missile intercepts is not positioned for ballistic terminal engagement. A formation that positions for ballistic engagement is not in the geometry for cruise missile intercepts. Against 5 batteries with 2 different terminal threat profiles, any single formation has a coverage gap against one type or the other. The Iranian mixed battery deployment was specifically designed around this geometric constraint. The defensive repositioning order from 5th Fleet arrived at 2:34 a.m., 3 minutes after the activation detection reached the operations floor. The order had 5 elements. Element 1, the Theodore Roosevelt and her immediate escorts were to hold their current position, 140 nautical miles south of the strait in the Gulf of Oman, rather than beginning the pre-transit approach. The 4-hour, 17-minute window before the scheduled transit entry point gave the defensive repositioning time to complete before the carrier needed to commit to an approach bearing. Element 2, the 2 destroyers currently furthest advanced in the Strait approach corridor, the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Chaffee, were to alter course immediately to position themselves at the geometrically optimal separation for a combined defense against the mixed battery threat. Specifically, Bunker Hill to position for SM-2 cruise missile intercept geometry against the western Nor battery sector, and Chafee to position for SM-3 intercept geometry against the Khalij Fars battery's engagement arc. 2 ships, 2 intercept geometries. Coverage across both terminal threat profiles. Element 3. 2 Los Angeles-class submarines operating in the Gulf of Oman and Strait area were to reposition toward the Iranian coastline at depth. This element was not about submarine versus missile defense. Submarines cannot intercept anti-ship missiles. It was about repositioning the submarines to positions from which they could conduct intelligence collection on the coastal battery operations, and, if ordered, execute strike missions against the battery sites if an escalation to lethal engagement was authorized. Element 4. An E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft was to be launched from the Roosevelt and repositioned to a surveillance orbit over the Strait approach area, providing the entire surface group and submarine force with an integrated air picture that would detect any missile launches before the weapons cleared the battery sites. Element 5. 2 EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft were to be launched on a mission to characterize the battery emissions in detail and develop jamming solutions for each of the 5 battery systems, both the cruise missile guidance radars and the Khalij Fars terminal seeker system. All 5 elements initiated within 8 minutes of the order. The most operationally complex element was the submarine repositioning, a Los Angeles-class submarine repositioning under a strait that is one of the world's busiest maritime choke points, at night, while maintaining tactical communications with surface forces above and avoiding detection by Iranian ASW assets in the area, requires a level of coordination between the submarine and surface forces that the surface picture alone cannot convey. The submarines operated under their own command authority for the repositioning. 5th Fleet provided the destination position parameters, and the submarine's commanding officers determined the route, depth, and speed profile for the movement. The repositioning was acknowledged at 2:41 a.m. No further communications confirmed completion. That is how submarine operations work. At 2:48 a.m., 17 minutes after the initial activation, the E-2D arrived on station and began transmitting the integrated air picture. The picture immediately provided information that the surface radar alone had not captured. A 6th contact, not a missile battery, was active approximately 12 kilometers behind the Khalij Fars battery site. The contact was assessed as an airborne early warning drone, a medium-altitude unmanned aircraft with a downward-looking radar that appeared to be operating to provide the Iranian battery network with its own picture of the approach corridor. An Iranian airborne early warning asset over the Strait approach. The 5 coastal batteries had their own eyes in the air. This changed the assessment in a specific and important way. A coastal battery network with its own airborne early warning capability is significantly more capable than one relying on shore-based radar alone. The drone could provide the battery operators with real-time tracking data on U.S. vessel positions across the full width of the approach corridor, including areas of the corridor where terrain masking or surface radar geometry reduced the quality of shore-based coverage. With airborne tracking data, the batteries could maintain accurate firing solutions on vessels transiting anywhere in the corridor. The defensive repositioning orders that had been issued at 2:34 a.m. had been based on assessment of the 5 batteries' shore-based radar coverage. The addition of airborne early warning coverage changed the geometry of the threat, potentially making positions that had appeared to be in the battery's lower effectiveness zones fully covered. 5th Fleet issued a supplementary repositioning guidance at 2:53 a.m., adjusting the Bunker Hill's target position to account for the extended coverage the Iranian drone provided. At 2:57 a.m., the EA-18G Growlers reached their operating positions and began jamming solution development against all 5 battery radar systems and the airborne drone's radar. The collection phase of the jamming mission, where the Growler crews characterized the enemy emissions before committing to a jamming waveform, lasted 12 minutes, producing detailed signatures for all 5 batteries and the drone. At 3:09 a.m., the Growlers began active jamming against the airborne drone's radar first, degrading its tracking capability before beginning jamming against the battery radars, on the assessment that removing the airborne early warning coverage would reduce the battery's overall situational awareness more significantly than jamming individual battery radars while the drone remained operational. The drone's radar emissions showed immediate disruption effects at 3:09 a.m. Power cycling, frequency changes, attempts by the drone's operators to find clear frequencies. The Growlers followed the frequency changes, maintaining suppression. The batteries themselves, all 5, showed more stable emission behavior under jamming. The Nor and Goddard batteries' guidance radars were partially suppressed, but showed the frequency agility characteristics of systems designed for operation in electronic warfare environments. The Khalij Fars system, the ballistic anti-ship weapon, showed the least jamming susceptibility. Its guidance radar, using a waveform architecture that the Growler's current configuration was not optimized to fully cover. The assessment at 3:14 a.m. Drone coverage partially suppressed. Nor and Gator batteries partially degraded. Khalij Fars battery minimally affected. The partial suppression was tactically meaningful for the cruise missile threat. The Khalij Fars gap was not yet addressed. Now consider the CENTCOM level decision facing 5th Fleet at 3:17 a.m. The carrier transit was scheduled to begin in 74 minutes. The defensive repositioning was substantially complete. The electronic warfare suppression was partially effective. The primary outstanding gap was the Khalij Fars terminal guidance system, which remained functional and provided Iran with an anti-ship ballistic capability that was not being effectively jammed. 3 options were presented to the CENTCOM duty officer. Option A, proceed with the carrier transit on the original schedule, relying on the SM-3 intercept geometry that the Chafee had positioned for and accepting the remaining Khalij Fars jamming gap. The transit was scheduled. Delay signals vulnerability. The SM-3 intercept geometry was the designed counter to the terminal threat. Option B, delay the transit by 3 to 4 hours, allowing additional time to develop improved Khalij Fars jamming solutions and to bring a second SM-3 capable asset into optimal intercept geometry. Accept the strategic signal that a carrier transit has been delayed by the activation of Iranian coastal missile systems. Option C, proceed with the transit but modify the approach route to take the carrier through the section of the corridor where the Khalij Fars battery's engagement arc was least favorable, accepting a longer, less efficient transit in exchange for a more geometrically favorable intercept position if the battery fired. What would you recommend? Comment A, B, or C below. Because CENTCOM chose a modified version of option C, the transit was not delayed. A delay would have communicated that 5 batteries could hold a US carrier out of the strait, but the approach route was modified to take the Roosevelt through the corridor's southern edge, where the Khalij Fars battery's steep downward engagement arc was partially masked by the approach geometry, while the SM-3 intercept position was adjusted to the modified approach vector. The transit began at 6:48 a.m., 31 minutes behind the original schedule, attributable to the route adjustment planning time rather than a defensive delay. At 4:19 a.m., 108 minutes after activation, all 5 Iranian coastal batteries reduced their emission levels from targeting posture to standard search mode. They did not deactivate entirely. They remained active, but the targeting posture was gone. The change occurred 19 minutes before the original transit window would have opened. It was timed in a way that could be interpreted as a stand-down triggered by the US defensive response, or as a deliberate conclusion to a collection operation that had achieved its objectives before the transit began. The Roosevelt transited the strait without incident on the modified route. The Bunker Hill and Chafee maintained their defensive positions throughout the transit. The Growlers provided jamming coverage. The E-2D maintained the integrated air picture. The submarines held their positions. No batteries fired. No missiles were launched. The carrier passed through. The post-incident assessment's primary finding addressed the Khalij Fars gap. The partially effective electronic warfare suppression against the Gator and Noor systems had been meaningful. But the Khalij Fars system's resistance to the Growler's current configuration represented a specific capability gap that needed to be addressed as a priority development item. The Naval Air Warfare Center was tasked with developing an updated jamming waveform configuration, optimized for the Khalij Fars guidance architecture within 90 days. The 5 batteries had activated at 2:31 a.m. The carrier had transited successfully. The defensive repositioning had been comprehensive and technically sound, but the Khalij Fars battery had been minimally jammed throughout the entire operation. Iran had activated an anti-ship ballistic missile system within range of a U.S. carrier strike group approach corridor and had kept it in functional targeting posture through 108 minutes of U.S. electronic warfare operations. That system was still on the coast when the Roosevelt completed her transit. It would be there for the next one too. Stay sharp, stay informed. This is Navy Strikeforce. We'll see you in the next one.